to start with free will, and then we're going to go into why I believe we have a metaphysical spirit, and then I'll go through the argument. It should be a fairly logical like sequence of arguments, but there are a lot of how do I say this? A lot of pieces to it. So I'm going to try to go through it as quickly or as I guess as efficiently as I can, but I do want to try to be clear. So let me start with the summary. We started talking about free will, so I'll start on the summary on free will. I don't expect this summary to convince you that we have libertarian free will, which is what I argue for. Kyle, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to remind, or at least let the new people here know that we encourage note taking because there's a lot of questions that might be coming up. We would respect everyone to please keep muted until it's over for Q&A. And that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Kyle. I'm going to be taking notes once we get into the Q&A section, because when someone asks questions, I want to write down what they said to make sure that I address it. So we all, like a lot of us, tend to take notes, and I will be as well. So that said, again, I don't expect this argument defending free will to convince you, because it was a 1-hour presentation the night we covered it. This one slide was a 1-hour presentation. So for tonight, just let's assume that this argument is correct until we get past the overall argument tonight. And then if people understand the overall argument tonight, but they feel like the weakest position is the argument defending libertarian free will, cool, we can dive into that. But I don't want that to be the focus, because we already covered that another night. And I did put the recording of that, which, like I said, I shared the wrong screen, so it's got my private notes, and hopefully I didn't write anything that embarrassed myself. So in any event, the argument basically goes like this. There is a 400 level computer science course, at least where I learned about this algorithm called Godel's Incompleteness Theorem. It was in a bunch of books on consciousness and free will conversations. I'm trying to remember. I think it was Helgoland was the one that I listened to a summary of recently. And basically, Godel's Incompleteness Theorem goes like this. In any logical system, it's either inconsistent or incomplete. And what that means is that in a logical system, if you have a black box and you give it a question and it comes out with an answer of true or false, there's one of two things true. Either the black box will tell you something is true that turns out not to be true, or it'll tell you something is not true that it turns out is actually true, which means that there is no perfect black box that will get 100% of questions right, as long as, and the requirement is the logical system has to contain something called Robinson arithmetic, which is basically like, I'm doing this from memory, so I think it's like addition, subtraction of integers infinitely. And so basically, though, it's not a big requirement. And basically what I showed is that you can turn the entire physical universe into a logical system of sorts, where you say, take the mass energy of the universe at any infinitesimally small three-dimensional point, and ask the laws of physics, capital T, the laws of physics, because if determinism is right, theoretically, if you take a point in time t, and then you take a Planck length of time later, which is believed to be the smallest unit of time possible. It's a really, really small unit of time, by the way. So if you take a Planck length of time, the next Planck length of time, and you try to look at the mass energy of the universe, if the only thing that determines what happens at the next moment in time is the laws of physics themselves, then the laws of physics themselves are a perfect black box, because they are actually answering every single question possible in the universe with 100% accuracy. And so it's called a proof by contradiction, where you say, well, if we know by Gödel's incompleteness theorem that a logical system can't have a perfect black box, and then you say, well, if the laws of physics were a perfect black box, then that contradicts the fact that we know no perfect black box exists by Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Then you have to say, well, maybe Gödel was wrong. And to be honest, when I learned about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, I immediately intuitively knew this was the case. And I went about trying to prove Gödel wrong because I was a determinist atheist at the time. And let's just say Gödel won, and now I believe in libertarian free will. So and I wrote the essay on defending it about 6 or 7 years after I learned about the theorem. But I had the argument in my head back then. So that said, you know, what it turns out is, if the physical universe moving from time t to t plus delta t, like another Planck length of time, is not the only thing determining what happens in the future, then there has to be something else that's not physical that is determining the future. And that basically opens up the space for free will, like libertarian free will, and for randomness to exist. And I would argue that if we do have a very logical possibility of free will existing, then there's two choices. Either our free will that we think is there is actually free will and it's right, and we have a metaphysical spirit, which, you know, religions call a soul, but I don't use that word because it's very loaded with a lot of religious dogma that I can't defend logically, and I try to stick to the beliefs that I can defend. And then the other possibility is that randomness has somehow cleverly disguised itself as making us think we have free will, when in fact we don't really have free will. And I would argue between those two choices, the simplest explanation that explains the phenomena that we observe is that we actually have free will, rather than that randomness has disguised itself as free will. I can't think of any good reason that randomness would disguise itself as if we had free will. And so it makes more sense to me that we do. So that said, if someone at least agrees that I showed why determinism is not right, and they don't buy that last Occam's razor argument, I don't argue with them at this point because it seems so clear to me. But I'm happy to talk about it tonight with y'all if that's really where you're stuck. But you know, that seems like the easy part of the argument, proving, you know, determinism wrong or less likely to be true than non-determinism was, I think, the hard part of the argument. So I went into that in a little more detail than I was planning to, mostly because we were talking about free will, and it seems very contentious for a lot of people. And in fact, out of philosophers, I think it's less than 20% or less than 15% of philosophers are believe in libertarian free will. It's the vast majority are compatibilists, which Hume started, where they believe in determinism and they also think we have free will. So that said, the implication is that if and I kind of covered this already, so I'm just going to actually go into the next slide. So the next question is, well, you know, there's this mind-body problem that philosophers have talked about since free will has been discussed for, you know, at least hundreds of years. I don't know when mind-body was first created in dualism, but basically the question is, how does a metaphysical, non-physical thing impact the physical world? And in my next slide, I'll go into that. But what I want to preface with is that Sir Roger Penrose, who's a Nobel Prize winner, got a request from Dr. Stuart Hameroff, who was at the time not a super well-known guy, whereas Dr. Roger Penrose was a very well-known guy. And he said, hey, Sir Roger Penrose, I want to talk to you about tracing consciousness back to its roots. I have some very interesting research that I want to do with you. And so they worked together. They traced consciousness back to, you know, quantum roots and nanotubules in the brain. And so I'm going to give I had another presentation on how consciousness works, where I presented this, you know, similar slide to this one. And then the next slide, I modified this one a little. And basically I summarize how I think consciousness operates, basically solving the mind-body problem related to dualism. So first you have the spirit, which is self-defining, which I didn't go into the fact that Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the type of question that Gödel's the black boxes can't answer consistently, are self-defining questions. It's a question that refers to itself. It's self-referential questions. And the spirit is, I believe, a self-defining thing. We decide for ourselves how we want to be and what we want to do and what we want to say. Now, we don't have complete control over any of that, but we have a lot of control, and we can cultivate different types of thoughts, or not cultivate different types of thoughts. So the spirit is self-defining and metaphysical. So that's the non-physical side of things. And then there's this non-deterministic influence via quantum fluctuation where we exert our will. That turns into quantum fluctuations in nanotubules in the brain that Hameroff and Penrose, trace the consciousness back to. But no one could get further back than that. And I would argue the reason they couldn't is because they're looking for a physical root. But if there is no physical root, they're looking for something that's not there, which is why they can't find it. If you acknowledge that my argument on free will, defending libertarian free will is right, then the root is very clear. It's the spirit. And at that point, you just say, okay, the spirit impacts at a quantum level nanotubules in the brain. The sub or unconscious then is what gets influenced by the nanotubules in the brain. And then the conscious becomes aware of those thoughts, processes them, and then through reinforcement and cultivation, penalization of certain types of thoughts, I try to say we should plant the seeds of happiness and pull out the weeds of harm, looking at happiness and harm at the root causes and trying to cultivate happiness and prevent harm. And there's also a paradigm of the good wolf and the bad wolf from the I forget the Native American, I think he was an Apache. That's, he basically said there are always two wolves fighting in my brain. There's the good wolf and the bad wolf, and they're ferocious and they fight. And and then the grandson asks, well, which one wins? And he says, well, the one that you feed the most. And so it's about whether or not you cultivate positive thoughts or negative thoughts. And so I would argue that's what's going on here. Then the next decision gets made in the spirit, and that decision, gets quantified by non-deterministic quantum fluctuations of those nanotubules in the brain, and then you get a cycle, and then you can choose to take action on the thoughts you have. These are the thoughts and your conscious awareness of the thoughts. And then, you can choose to consciously take action based on those thoughts or not. So I did tell you we're going to cover a lot of ground tonight. So now we've talked about free will and we've talked about dualism. Now let's go on to something else. Where did the spirit come from? Right? That's kind of a logical question, is like, where the hell can a metaphysical spirit come from? Like, if we live in a physical world and the physicalists are right, and there's only physical things, but there's somehow this metaphysical spirit, like, how would a metaphysical spirit evolve, like, within a deterministic universe? And, I would agree that most of the cosmos is deterministic. Like, if you look at the stars and the sun and the moons and, most of this very large visible universe that we live in, most of it seems pretty deterministic. Like, it doesn't seem like the star, I mean, there are people who claim stars have free will, but I don't yet have a good reason to believe that's true. And so I would argue most of the universe is deterministic in the way that it works, or at least what's called adequately deterministic, meaning the quantum randomness fluctuations of those bodies even each other out so that they end up, net being deterministic. So how could that metaphysical spirit evolve? I would argue it can't have evolved because it's metaphysical. You can't create something non-physical from a purely physical universe. And so that spirit had to have come from some type of higher power. That's what I call God with a lowercase g, is the God that I think I can logically defend. Now, I think that the Abrahamic God has been, there's good reason to think that the Abrahamic God does not exist. I'll go into that in a few slides. And please, Christians and Muslims and Abrahamic religion people, don't get mad at me for this. Just listen with an open mind. You don't have to agree with me, but just consider that there may be another perspective, one shared in ancient Greece that I think has held up to this day, although modern philosophers have renamed it. But yeah. So basically, I would argue at some point, and then, if we talk about you know, where did the spirit come from on Earth, right? I would argue at some point life on Earth became complex enough that it could house house a spirit, and either God or his servants imbued that life with a spirit, giving it free will. And that could have been at very low levels of life. Someone was talking about, well, do you think that plants have free will? Look, I don't know exactly where the line is. The people were, that conversation was starting to delve into some of the science of tree roots and the ways that trees sort of help each other in ways that seem a little, not self-serving or altruistic, and where they, help each other in times that, it doesn't seem like they should be doing that based on evolution. So there is some limited evidence that plants, might have some very, very limited sense of will. But I don't want to debate like where libertarian free will starts and ends. I just want to say that at least humans, I think I can defend, have libertarian free will, and dolphins and dogs and things that are higher intelligence. I think, you know, if we do, they probably do as well. And so they probably have a metaphysical spirit. I disagree with Descartes, who thought that animals had no spirit, and so torturing them was okay. I hard disagree on that one. I don't think torturing, um, especially those types of animals, is okay. That said, you might then say, well, and this is going to be the skeptic's question is, but I'm going to anticipate what David might ask. So David or DLJ is, well, why would this God create spirits in the first place? Well, a spirit has the non-deterministic ability to increase happiness and decrease harm in its sphere of influence. And I would argue that's a universally agreeable like goal, like more happiness, less harm. And I can define what I mean by happiness and what I mean by harm. It's not an intuitive, like, immediate, it is intuitive version of happiness, but it's more specific and more clear, that gets rid of some of the ambiguity that people think is around happiness. That said, we can get into that in the Q&A portion. If people have that question, just ask me and I can go into what I mean by happiness and what I mean by harm. And basically, I think God expects us to increase happiness and decrease harm for those we can influence, which is part of why I started the FTI, is to create an organization that helps groups of people do that. And learning how to do that, I think, is an innate purpose of life that is expected of us. And I would argue, even if you don't believe in God, utilitarianism is a great secularly grounded morality that more or less says the same thing with slightly different words, but more or less we're getting at the same thing. I try to, like in the FTI 5 intentions, which are common values in the FTI, I try to address some of the common objections of utilitarianism. I'm not a consequentialist. Utilitarianism is considered consequentialism, which means that the end result you get, the ends justify the means in some respects. I'm not in that camp, but I do think more happiness and less harm is good. And so whether you believe in God or not, I would argue, increasing happiness and decreasing harm is something that we should strive for. And there's no requirement to believe in God or not believe in God in the FTI. We have atheists, we have agnostics, we have religious people, we have spiritual people. I fall into the spiritual camp because, that sort of fits my belief system the best. So the next question I would ask is, all right, so God created these spirits. We have a metaphysical spirit. Well, would that metaphysical spirit be disposable? Is it like one and done? Like you live one life and then you go to eternal heaven or eternal hell, or you just disappear and you no longer exist after that one life? It seems to me like not a super convincing argument. That none of those things seem super convincing to me. Like, in a, 80-year life or 100-year life, for those of us that live a little longer, to think that we get eternal damnation because we made one too many bad decisions, or that we get eternal bliss because we made one just enough good decisions, doesn't quite make sense to me for decisions made during a finite lifetime. So, I think something happens to the spirit after death. And so the next question is, what happens? I would say, given that God created spirits to increase happiness and decrease harm, I would argue we're meant to grow and learn in this life. And we are meant to grow and learn how we can increase happiness and decrease harm, for other beings and for ourselves at the same time. And so I would argue that the metaphysical spirit is probably recycled. As I mentioned, this has been studied by science. I also have this a priori argument that I'm kind of giving here about that. I think when we die, we're reborn again to learn in our next life the lessons that we failed to learn in this life. And until we learn those lessons, I think we're gonna suffer, right? If we keep hitting our head against the wall until we learn to stop hitting our head against the wall and to do something about whatever it was that caused us to start hitting our head against the wall, we're gonna keep suffering from hitting our head against the wall. And so better to learn the lesson and learn from our mistakes, and then we'll find that our lives get better over time as we learn from our mistakes and, as I said, pull out the weeds of harm and plant the seeds of happiness. And so I would argue that since God is fair, the more we increased happiness and decreased harm in this life, the more influence we get in the next life, and vice versa. The more we decreased happiness and increased harm in this life, the less influence we have in the next life. And so, as I mentioned, and I have I just put a link in the slide notes. I'll put the slides up afterwards. I have to remember to make sure that I shared the slides, but I'll put the slide notes in. And in the notes, I just put a link to Googling science of reincarnation, and there are dozens of articles, mostly popular science because they have good SEO, but you can go to academic articles. If you go to scholar.google.com, and you can look for academic articles on reincarnation, and that's where I found the meta study, but unfortunately I didn't save the link of that, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it. It wasn't that hard to find. It took me less than 5 minutes to find it. And basically what they've studied is children will have these past life memories. I'll give one example. Usually they're due to traumatic experiences like dying a traumatic death. And then the child, seems to remember, experiences of the past life where they died a traumatic death. At least those are the ones that I came into when I was doing research on this. So one example, a child said, described how they were killed in the past life, and they actually, and I don't there's got to be more going on than just reincarnation here, because he said this is where the person who killed me buried the body, and the child actually pointed to where the person was killed. There was an unmarked grave where a body was buried, and they ended up catching the criminal that killed the person. And so how do you explain that? How do you explain a child figuring out where a body was buried, when this is studied by science so that there's no foul play? And then you can create your own study and reproduce it. And I think the skeptics here should create their own study and, interview children that have had these stories and see whether or not you can explain the childhood memories that seem to come from a past life. So that said, basically I want next to go into the debunking of the Abrahamic God or omnipotent God. And so the idea of omnipotent God, I think, was debunked from something that is now called the problem of evil, but at the time was called Epicurus' trilemma. And basically what he says is, if God is unable to prevent evil, then he's not all powerful. If God is not willing to prevent evil, then he's not all good. If God is both willing and able to prevent evil, then why does evil exist in the first place? Now, I'm going to go into some common counterexamples to Epicurus' trilemma that help people continue to believe in the Abrahamic God in spite of this trilemma. But I think it's a pretty solid argument, and I'll go into why I don't find the counterargument super convincing. But the main reason that I hear is that God wants us to have free will, and so God gave us the ability to cause harm, or what I would call evil is causing harm and or decreasing happiness. And God gave us that ability because he wants us to have free will. But I don't think that argument really holds up, because let's just have a simple thought experiment. Imagine you're a benevolent, omnipotent God, and you want to imbue life with free will. but you don't want evil to happen. Why not allow any act that is either neutral, a little bit good, or very good? You can still distinguish between who are the best people and who are the, not best people, the ones that are just neutral. But no one has to cause harm in that world. You still have free will. You can still have libertarian free will, but there's no evil caused because benevolent, omnipotent God prevents any evil from happening. You can only do neutral, little bit of good, or a lot of good, anywhere on a spectrum of good, but no evil. Now, I would argue, in fact, that God also didn't create the universe, so I'm not a deist. If I recall the definition correctly, deist or theist. I think it's theist that says that God created the universe. But creating the universe would say that you have ultimate control over mass energy at scale. And that kind of power, I would think, would allow God to prevent evil, at least on Earth. And I would think that if he was that powerful, that he would. So I think it's unlikely that God has the power to create the physical universe. We did another event on the origins of the universe. And I basically made the argument that I think the physical universe has always existed. And I think this omnipotent or this powerful, higher power has always existed as well. Because I can't imagine a way that a metaphysical, higher power could have been begot. How could it start from nothing? Just like I can't imagine how the physical universe could start from nothing. And I don't think scientists have done a good job explaining, what existed a billion years before the start of the Big Bang. I know modern scientists say that the universe itself started at the Big Bang, but their math doesn't really add up and is not consistent with that. And they have not, in my opinion, given a convincing argument of how something came from nothing or how the first moment in time came about. So that said, I'm digressing a bit, but a couple of other common arguments. So I already covered that one. Another common argument is that we want God to be benevolent and omnipotent. And of course we do. Like, it would be great to have a benevolent, omnipotent God that would never let something bad to happen to us. But we all know bad things have happened to us, right? I don't think anyone in this Zoom has ever had no bad experiences their entire lives, right? If anyone did, you can raise your hand right now. I would love for you to speak. But I don't think anyone's going to raise their hand and say, nothing bad has ever happened to me my entire life. Javier, are you really going to say nothing bad has ever happened to you your entire life? Okay, so Javier is a jokester. So, but at
No, no,
least
no, no. I do want to explain this because you asked the question.
no,
It
I
depends
I
the way.
only I only wanted to know if you've never had anything bad happen to you your entire life. After the presentation, there will be plenty of time for people to ask questions. So don't worry,
Okay,
you'll have plenty of time to talk.
okay,
So
no problem. Thank
no
you.
worries. So so of course we want to have an omnipotent, benevolent God that's always looking out for us. That feels very comforting. But I guess I can easily imagine that if God were benevolent and omnipotent, then like we wouldn't have those bad things happen to us. And I'm not anywhere, and like I can say just for myself, if I had that power, I would easily imagine a world where none of those bad things would happen. We would just have neutral, little good, and a lot of good. And I'm not anywhere near as wise and powerful as I think this higher power that I call God is. So if I can figure out how to do it with with omnipotence and benevolence, I think that a capital G God that's omnipotent and benevolent could certainly figure out how to make the world not have evil and still allow free will. So that said, wanting something is great, and as David likes to tell me, just because you want it doesn't mean that it's true. And I agree with David on that. And even though it would feel great to have an omnipotent, benevolent God, I just don't buy it because Epicurus's trilemma seems pretty strong to me, and I haven't heard a good counter argument yet that I couldn't poke holes in. So that said, I do think that minimizing harm and maximizing happiness is good, and we should do that. I do think God tries to do that, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But then the last argument that some people make is that God can't exist because of the trilemma. Saying that, well, because omnipotent benevolent God doesn't exist, therefore no God exists. Well, that's a logical fallacy. Just because one type of God doesn't exist doesn't mean no type of God can exist. I think given what I've talked about tonight, if my argument defending free will, libertarian free will is right, there's far more evidence that there is some higher power that's metaphysical that, helped our spirits come into existence, right? And created the cycle of life that I think we're all in. And so, I think there's far more evidence that there is some higher power, and probably more than one higher power, quite frankly, although I can't form a super solid opinion on whether or not there's one higher power or more, but I think there's a fairly good argument that there's more than one higher power, because if we're all on this path of spiritual development, and if my argument defending that the universe is infinitely large is right, which was what we talked about on the origins of the universe, then there are actually an infinite number of life forms in the universe. And so there's got to be an infinite number that are, more advanced than us. So there have to be a lot of higher powers. To think that humanity is at the epiphany of all life in the universe seems a little not very convincing to me. So if let's see, what else did I want to cover? So basically, I'm just saying that it's not that there's no God whatsoever, it's that God is not both benevolent and omnipotent. And that's why I use the lowercase g, because the God that I can defend is not omnipotent and benevolent, but he is powerful and benevolent. And I'll go into why I think God is infinitely benevolent and loving, just not omnipotent in all physical aspects. I think God has an influence on the physical world, but not an omnipotent influence on the physical world. And there's this old quip that atheists love to use, which is God can't make a rock that's too big for him to carry, right? And I actually think, even though it's kind of said tongue in cheek, it's actually a self-defining statement that's very like the Godel statement that Godel's Incompleteness theorem uses for Godel to prove his theorem right. So I think that actually does a good job of showing that God can't be omnipotent, because an omnipotent thing can't create something too big for him to lift, a boulder too big for him to lift. Next, what can I defend about God? So I think that God is powerful, even if not omnipotent. So why is that? So by the way, if anyone has a good counter argument to Epicurus's argument, I would love to hear it, but I haven't heard one yet. I do want to say that if God is responsible for the fact that we have a metaphysical spirit and free will, then I don't understand. This is a slight digression. I won't go there. So basically, let me do a quick recap of why I think God is benevolent and powerful. So if God exists and he's the reason that we have libertarian free will, and Epicurus's trilemma says that God is not benevolent and omnipotent, well, if God gave us free will, he's got to be fairly powerful to give us free will, to imbue us with the ability to make non-deterministic decisions, which gave us a spirit that will allow us to control our bodies. But if he's not omnipotent, he's not all powerful. Now, if we look objectively at the trend of life, you can look at books like Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, and you can look at even trends of life like natural selection, which select for the most successful attributes. Basically, like, life has been moving in the direction of improvement or progress pretty much as far back as we look. There are setbacks, but things continue to progress at a slow, steady pace. And if you look at the definition of good and evil that I've been using so far, which is increasing happiness and decreasing harm, we've been getting more happiness and less harm in the world. If you look at 100 years ago to 1,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago to, look back by powers of 10, things have been getting better and better. And so things are moving in the direction of maximizing happiness and minimizing harm. Now, there's still setbacks all over the place, and we could be set back to the dark ages if things go really badly and nuclear holocaust, blows out, that, like things could go really badly. There's a lot at stake at the world today. And so I do think we have a lot of responsibility to try to make sure that the world ends up continuing to move in the right direction. But if we looked at currently accepted measures of improvement, which are like happiness, longevity, health, crime, all of these factors, when you look at them, have been moving in a positive direction. That's what Steven Pinker's book. I'm not going to spend tonight trying to prove that to you, but I will say, read Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now. He does a very good job of looking back historically, and we basically live in the healthiest, wealthiest, safest world that humanity has ever known. Now, if you watch the news, you would think we live in the worst phase of humanity and the worst era of humanity, because, oh my God, this person got robbed the other day. Well, back in the day, a larger percentage of people were being robbed, but no one knew about it because there was no news. And the news just wants to sell papers, and they sell their papers. And now they're not selling papers anymore, right? They're selling digital eyeballs, or digital news that's trying to attract your eyeball. And so they're telling you the most, gruesome stories of what's going on, but that's not really representative of what's going on in the world. And so that said, it seems to me like if God is reincarnating people who do a good job of increasing harm and decreasing harm in the world to have more influence in their next life, and vice versa, then God may well be powerful and influencing the world just through the cycle of humanity and animals alone. And that's karma. We had another event on karma, so we're touching on a lot of past events that we had, and I tried to make, using a lot of these similar arguments, a good logical argument for karma, which I won't go into tonight. But I will say I entertain the possibility that God could be malevolent and just not very powerful, and humanity is, by our good graces and trying hard, overcoming God's will, his malevolent will. But I think that's pretty unlikely, and I'll explain why. So when God decided to grant us with free will, giving us a spirit, he seems to have given us the ability to reason, right? People can reason when we stay calm, cool, and collected. Now, if we get all emotional, a lot of people lose their ability to reason, which is unfortunate. But I would argue that the ability to reason is generally leads us in the direction of increasing happiness and decreasing harm when we can think straight. And so, I would argue that using reason, and reason is held as the highest good by both Stoicism and Buddhism, which I think are two very great fountains of wisdom, and they use reason to achieve those ends. Now, it makes sense to me that God would imbue us, along with free will, with the ability to reason, so that we can find, what I would call morality, but I don't like the word morality. I would say ethics. And someone said, there was a distinction between ethics and morality. I would love for them to explain in the Q&A portion what they think the difference between ethics and morality are. For me, I think morality has just been used by religion and therefore gets a bad rap. But when I look up the dictionary definitions of ethics and morality, and I'm pretty sure I looked in the SCP too, and they're pretty much synonymous. It's just that there's right actions and wrong actions, and that's all both of them seem to say to me. And I would argue there are right actions and wrong actions, and in our gut, if we trust our gut and we use our ability to reason, which I would say God has given us, we can get a sense of what's fair to do in different situations as long as we can see the truth clearly. And I do think that if people don't listen to their gut and they ignore it, then we start to lose the ability to tell right and wrong as well as we used to. And a lot of people get all twisted up, in their head about what is right and wrong because they let their ego sort of run things and say, what's good for me is what's right. And therefore, that's all that matters. Now, if we conclude that God is benevolent and powerful and is making the world a better place over time, then while God may not be able to eliminate evil, he is working with the help of those of us trying to cooperate with him to reduce evil and increase good in the world. And I think is doing a good job at that. So in conclusion, I think we should do our best to do that as well. Because, even if you end up, giving yourself more in this life, than you perhaps deserve, you will end up, with less influence in your next life if you weren't aligning with fairness. Now, why focus on those within our sphere of influence? So I talk a lot about increasing happiness and decreasing harm for those within our sphere of influence. The reason is because, and I get this from Stoic wisdom, where you separate what's in your control from what's out of your control. And I would argue that trying to change things out of your control is fruitless. You're not going to be able to do it. And also, when you can influence someone more, they can also influence you back more. And if you help those that you can influence more, then they will be more likely to reciprocate, help you back, and then you are now better able to help other people. And so it creates this synergistic viral giving and helping, and that creates more positivity within our sphere of influence. Now, at times, like giving outside of our current sphere of influence and making something else within our sphere of influence can help more. So for example, giving people in low-cost countries money will have a bigger impact than giving people money in a high-cost country. But that is, you can put those types of decisions within your sphere of influence by shifting your mindset. So, and deciding where is the better place to invest. And I think we ultimately all have to trust our own judgment about where we want to put our time and resources. So, the rule of thumb, I would say, good to give altruistically and try to influence, other people to the positive, like in a positive way. And when people give back to you and help you back, then, help them even more, right? And that creates that synergistic, like, help each other, type of, and it doesn't need to be transactional. It's just a sort of general sense of, mutual benefit. And then, yeah, so I think that's really, and ultimately, just a quick revisit of that. I think God and or his, higher powers determine what happens to us after we pass away and determine how much influence we have in our next life. And so I don't think it's wise to oppose, what we believe God wants. For me, like, I'm pretty confident that, helping people achieve their goals, which is what I mean by increasing happiness, as long as those goals don't cause significant amounts of unnecessary harm, is a good thing, and trying to prevent harm is a good thing. And so that's what I try to do. I haven't heard a good reason to think otherwise, but at this point, I'm going to leave it open to questions. And if someone thinks they have a good reason that doing otherwise is good, I welcome the questions. And the one thing I want to say in the Q&A portion of the evening is limit comments or questions to one comment or question at a time. Try to limit the length of a comment or question to 2 or 3 minutes so that we get everybody being able to answer. If we end up with no one else's hands up, you can take longer than that. It's no problem. I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak that wants to. And then if you want to respond to like someone's comment or question or something that I said, just speak up, like, because there are two groups of people here, like there are two screens, and so I can't see if people make symbols or stuff like that. So just speak up, and we'll try to give you a chance to speak. If two people speak up at the same time, someone will yield, or I'll just call on one of the two people to go first and then the other one next. And if you're doing a just speak up, make sure you're on the same topic that was just brought up. Don't introduce a new topic. For that, you have to raise your hand. And using these rules, we can have a lot of back and forth conversation, but we still sort of keep some sense of, one topic at a time and having back and forth conversations amongst different people. And if you're commenting on someone's comment or question and you're speaking up, try to keep it to under 20 seconds so that we can keep things moving on that topic. So think about what you want to say before you say it. And that said, Les had his hand up first. So Les, what do you have to say, my friend?
Oh, thanks, Garrett, and thanks for quite a wide-ranging talk today. You've covered quite a fair bit. I'm trying to get clear in my mind the slide you had with the arrows about decision making and partly incorporating the hammer-off model of indeterminacy in our decision making. I've got a question about that that model. Is it possible for you to put that page up? Because then I can ask more particularly what it was. So you've got the hammer off indeterminacy in the microtubules happening where that vertical line is non-deterministic influence via quantum fluctuations in free will and you've got their nanotubules in the brain. Then somehow the subconscious is involved, and then we've got the conscious awareness, and it's this feedback loop that I want to ask about, where we have the conscious awareness of thoughts, and then it seems like we decide whether we're going to go with what's appeared in our conscious awareness and either reinforce it or not reinforce it. And it goes back to the spirit. And this is getting to my question. I mean, I always like to think in terms of practical examples, and I'm thinking about Doctors Without Borders rings me up and I decide whether I'm going to donate at that time. And somehow, the indeterminacy in the microtubules in my brain make it so that I decide on that day I'm not going to, or I'm going to donate to Doctors Without Borders. It goes through that process, moving to the right, coming to the conscious awareness that I've got a decision to make. I've made the decision. Now I reflect on it through the feedback. Goes back to the spirit. And this is what I'm trying to get a handle on. And then it goes back through that indeterminacy process with the neurons in my brain, the microtubules in the neurons, and whichever way that randomly goes, it seems the next time the microtubules and the randomness there will bring about whether I decide to give to Doctors Without Borders the next time or not. So even though I've gone through that feedback loop and I decide, next time I'll decide again, but it's the randomization of that process where it's not guaranteed that even though in the feedback loop I decide, yes, I want to give to Doctors Without Borders, when it's randomized, it'll be randomized either yes, give, or not give. So it seems like that feedback, to me, it seems the feedback process is not really doing anything that's going to lead to any concrete result, because in the end, it's going through that hammer off indeterminacy process again. So that's what I'm not clear about.
So I think you're assuming that the non-deterministic influence is random. Is that right?
Well, it could be 80-20 or 99-100. Say there's a 99% bias that I'm going to give again, but with that feedback loop, what is it? What is it that the randomization process? How can the randomization process go from a 99% bias to a 99% bias? Because it go instead of from the existing 99% bias, it might go the other way. It might go downwards to an 88.
You're still assuming that the quantum fluctuations are determined randomly and that the outcome is determined randomly. So you're still in kind of a determinist mindset. I don't think it is random. It's a choice of will. It's a non-random. It's the force of the will decides. Now there's a probability of you deciding to give or not give, but you as a human being, as a sentient being, get to make a non-deterministic choice. It's not randomness that's deciding whether or not you donate or not. So what's happening is every time you make a decision to donate or to not donate, this cycle goes on. And so you observe in your conscience, there's a mailer that says, do you want to donate to Doctors Without Borders? You think about it and you go, well, this is how it made me feel the last time I donated. You put a bunch of factors into your mind and then it gets fed into your spirit. Your spirit is what makes the decision. That's where the decision is made. Now, neuroscientists have proven that the decision is made before we become consciously aware of it. So that's been proven, and this explains why that's been proven, but why we can still make a non-deterministic decision, because you get the flyer for the Doctors Without Borders, then you cultivate a certain type of thought that says, I'm going to give. And let's just suppose the first time you give, then you give and it goes into the nanotubules in the brain. the thought comes up, I'm going to donate to them. And then another cycle comes up and says, I'm going to take action on donating to them. And then your conscious action is you donate. Now, next month, they send you another flyer and you go through this all again and you get to decide again. So yeah, you go through this cycle multiple times. Every time you get a flyer or that you think about, maybe I should donate to Doctors Without Borders, and something like stimulates that thought, it goes through another decision-making process, but it's not randomness that's making you decide. It's your will. It's I don't know how to say it other than like things that we currently, like, I think I can explain this much, but like it, other than saying that the spirit can decide things and it has the autonomy to make decisions, like, that's a thing. And it either does or it doesn't. I think I have a good logic argument that it does. And when it makes that decision, this is how it culminates. It goes into quantum fluctuations in the nanotubules, and the rest is pretty well understood. From the nanotubules to the conscious awareness and the actions, that's the nervous system, it's the way the brain works, the different hemispheres of the brain, the different parts of the brain that all handle different types of things. The cerebrum handles logical thinking. The rest of it is all pretty well understood because it's been studied by physicalists. What they don't understand is the spirit. And I think, Les, with all due respect, I really like all the things you have to say, and it's great to see you again. But I think you're not quite understanding how a metaphysical spirit could make a non-random decision. Is that a fair guess?
Look, I can understand. I very much disagree with bringing spirits into it. But what I don't understand is you've got quantum fluctuations there in the diagram, and I'm still very unclear what the role, what work is these quantum fluctuations doing, when it seems like the major roles are the spirit and the physical biology of the brain, the way the neurons interact physically. They're the two components doing all the work. And I can understand that model. And I'm not understanding where the quantum fluctuations, and you got that explicitly in the diagram, as I say. I'm not sure what work. It seems to me the quantum fluctuations are doing no work. And if they are doing
work. No, they
work,
are doing work. Yeah. So then basically the spirit is metaphysical. And I know you don't like the term spirit, but I think I tried to logically defend that it's such a spirit exists. And did you come to the discussion on free will?
I did, yeah.
Okay. So did you find, like, if we want to go down the path of like that argument, like we can, but I think I made a pretty good argument that determinism is not the only force influencing the future, and that therefore that a metaphysical spirit is having an influence on the future. And if so, how does it impact the brain is the big question, which is the question of dualism. And this is an explanation of how do you solve the problem of the mind-body problem, or the problem of dualism. And so it's basically the spirit fluctuates, like basically non-deterministically impacts quantum fluctuations. So it's not random fluctuations in the nanotubules. It's non-deterministic influence on the nanotubules, so that you can get an expected outcome in the brain. And that expected outcome then breeds a specific thought, which then breeds a specific action in a non-deterministic way. And so that's how the metaphysical spirit impacts the body, is through these nanotubules and quantum fluctuations.
Yeah, and that's the bit I don't get, because I cannot, well, I think it's not doing your model any favors by bringing in hammer-off indeterminacy through the nanotubules, because you keep saying it's not random, but that's exactly what the quantum indeterminate model is. It is a random process, and that's why I think it's not.
They assume it's random because they don't believe a metaphysical spirit could exist.
Right.
And I actually wrote to Sir Roger Penrose, but he's in his 90s now, so he's not writing back to people. But I should write to Dr. Hemroff. But I think that if they heard a good argument defending a metaphysical spirit, they could acknowledge that it may not be randomness in those quantum fluctuations in the nanotubules. It could be a willed, direction that the nanotubules are changing in quantum indeterminacy, because that's what they're missing in their research. They said, well, we got it all the way back to the nanotubules, but we can't trace the origin of the quantum fluctuations. And the reason they can't is they're looking for a physical root cause. The problem is there is no physical root cause. So scientists and neuroscientists will be on a wild goose chase until they acknowledge that there's no physical root cause. And that's what Gödel's incompleteness theorem tells us. There can't be a physical root cause, or the laws of physics are a perfect black box. But Gödel says there is no perfect black box. So, it just has to be this way from what I can tell. Again, I'm open to feedback, but,
that feedback, though, it does feel like you're cherry picking, if I can like defend the person who's talking, because you're saying right, and then this must be right just because it makes more sense. Nothing works like that in a matter of science. This isn't a scientific argument. You're saying, well, I don't think this works this way. I just want it to work this way.
I didn't say I wanted it to work, Benjamin. I gave an entire argument an hour long defending this perspective. So if you have some point that I made that you disagree with, raise your hand and definitely we'll talk about it. But we do have a lot of hands
I thought
up,
you said to respond in the argument just by speaking. So sorry, I was just responding to what you guys were talking about just now.
Yeah, no, I want you to. I welcome your thoughts, and I welcome your opposition to my argument. I'm just saying I wasn't cherry picking. I gave a very long and detailed argument. I wasn't cherry picking anything. I'm tying together things that are not yet tied together with information that the people coming up with these things don't have yet. So it's not I don't think it's cherry picking, but if you think it is, feel free to raise your hand and go ahead. You're coming across with pretty bad audio, Joshua. All right, I think he wasn't realizing he was off mute. So Carrie, you're next. And thank you, Les, for your question.
Okay, so bringing the conversation back to God, I think that how we define God has huge implications to the discussion, obviously. And a few of the terms that were used here tonight were, all powerful and omnipotent, and the idea of benevolence, right? And what I'm wondering is if, when we're talking about all powerful or omnipotent, I'm wondering if those concepts are even important to the discussion. If we define God as the foundation of existence, additional attributes beyond that, I don't know if they really necessarily mean anything. I mean, this is a critique I could throw at Godel, but I'll save that for later because I'm limited to one topic and I'm trying to be good.
No, you can raise your hand again, So,
I will.
Thank you.
Yeah. And
so.
on benevolence, I don't know if the universe is necessarily designed for our satisfaction. And what my question is what is good at different scales, right? If I'm viewing the world at a different scale than what we find important, what would it mean? And I guess I'm thinking that there's a kind of chauvinism for our own personal satisfaction, or our own personal scale, for one thing. But right, I can view the human body in terms of cellular interaction, and what's good for the body at that level might be different than what my mind thinks might be good for me today, right? Or I mean, if you look at things at an atomic level, what's good at that level? Does that word have any meaning? Maybe if we're going to hypothesize that there are, spirit levels above our own, what's good for that? And how do those all interact, right? There's this idea of presuming the mind of God, even if God is just an organizing principle, a la Spinoza, that we might be reading more into it than is justified just based on our particular idea of what we want.
Do you have a specific question? I can respond to what you said, but I didn't know.
Oh, Yeah, that was just an observation more than, I mean, I'm not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing as much as addressing the framework and particularly how those two terms play into our discussion of God.
Yeah, and again, like if I was going to believe in a God that I wanted to believe in, I'd probably believe that he was omnipotent and benevolent, because that'd make me feel better that everything that went wrong for a good reason. But I don't believe that. I think lots of people made some really bad decisions, and because of that, things went wrong when they shouldn't have. Now I think ultimately that we're all judged at the end of our lives, and God or his servants will treat us fairly. But as far as a definition of God, I just jotted something down quickly, which is powerful, benevolent. The God that I can defend is powerful, benevolent, fair, and is the origin of the metaphysical spirit. That's what I think I can defend, and what I tried to defend tonight. And if anyone has a reason that I failed to do that effectively, I welcome the point on the specific place where I talked about that, and I can go back to the slide and we can talk about that specific part of the argument, because I defended each one of those on a specific slide. But that said, while Carrie, I do agree that what's good on a cellular interaction level might be different than what's good on the human body interaction. I think that we kind of innately judge things by the level of good or bad for a sentient being. And I think that's how God looks at it too. That's my guess, because why, if God created spirits and sentient being, like the essence of sentient beings, why would he not judge what's good or bad for those spirits? Now, some people might say, well, I feel better when I smoke, therefore smoking is good for me. And they say that, and they're convinced of that. That doesn't mean it's true, right? They may well die in 2 years because they smoked. And maybe they needed to die in 2 years, maybe, but I don't think so. I think, we're all better off with time to learn, unless we're so egotistical that we're not learning anything in this life. And that's where I think the person who says, I feel better, is just saying, this is what my egotism wants, and not necessarily what's good for me and those around me. Because, oh, by the way, when you're smoking, if there are people around you, you're also causing harm to them. And so I think you can, and this is where I can go into the definitions of what I mean by increasing happiness and decreasing harm. But I think I do have a very specific definition of increasing happiness and decreasing harm, but it's at the level of a sentient being, not at microorganism level. I think cells are just deterministic pieces of the human body. They're not sentient, but if anyone has a good reason that cells are sentient, I welcome you to put links in the chat.
But do you think that spirit, if it's separate, could interact in the way cells do and create a higher level of consciousness that may have its own ideas of good or benevolence?
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that we can talk about human intelligence on an individual level. We can also talk about like a hive mind, right? This idea of spirit. I mean, is this something that is distinct, or are we manifestations of something that is actually an undivided whole, but it just seems like an individual thing to us? Kind of like, spray in the ocean, droplets of water are seen as distinct, but they fall back into the same sea.
So you're talking about monism, is that right?
Could be.
Okay.
But I mean,
Yeah,
our brains are made of separate cells, right? But
right.
we have this sense of a singular consciousness. Now, there are subconscious or unconscious acts in our mind. We could have two consciousnesses in our brain, and that our forward consciousness is not necessarily aware of, right?
Well, there are people with multiple personality disorder, which theoretically have multiple personalities in their head. Now, one hypothesis for that is that someone could have multiple spirits in their body, and theoretically that could explain multiple personality disorder. I haven't studied that, but I think it would be an interesting thing to study, whether or not there's a way to confirm or refute that. So I hear what you're saying. I think the that's something that I entertain. But I think that until I use Occam's razor, because until we have a good reason to think that a sentient being is something other than what we inherently believe a sentient being is, I'm going to believe that it is what we inherently believe it is because A, it's effective, B, it explains everything we understand. And so for Occam's razor, it's the simplest explanation that explains the phenomena that we observe. And so I'll believe it until there's a good reason not to. If you have a good reason not to, raise your hand. I'm open to hearing it. I just haven't heard one yet. Claudio, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, and others familiar faces like Leslie and
Yeah,
other
we have a
people.
bunch.
Yeah, there's a lot of different belief systems, here on this platform
Yes.
and everywhere else. So, I appreciate that. I respect that. Yeah, I have a question, but I need to get back to Epicurus's argument against an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, all-knowing, all-loving God. Now, if one of the premises is incorrect, then you would have to agree that the conclusion is incorrect. Now, the first premise is God willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he is omnipotent. Well, he's able if he's an omnipotent God, but is he willing? Maybe he's unwilling to do that for very good reasons. Those believers can counter-argue the first premise by saying that evil is necessary on this planet with the limited natural resources and the way that we are built, our biological, our chemistry, and etc. And that pertains to soul making. Now, I got the question: is it even possible, to really know, understand, and appreciate the beautiful things, or like emotional states, like compassion, altruism, kindness, peace, bliss, happiness, love, selflessness, humility, all the noble traits, here, not only here on earth, but in the afterlife, without experiencing firsthand their negative counterparts, the opposites, like indifference, cruelty, stress, sadness, hate, selfishness, greed, narcissism, and so on, right? Can really appreciate them, actually feel them in here and in the afterlife. The theodicy can claim that God did not intend us to be perfect robots without any memories of suffering of themselves and the suffering of others, right? How can we appreciate how can we recognize the afterlife as blissful and true happiness without actually going through their opposites, right? So that's my question.
Without going through what? I'm
But
sorry.
that,
Sorry,
huh?
Claudio. Without going through what? You mean without going through difficulties?
Yeah, without actually experiencing the struggling, death, suffering, how can you actually appreciate the good things of life, existence, without actually going through them? Like reincarnation does appear to solve that. Like you said, we learn how to become happy and how to help others. That's one way. But God, the Abrahamic God, uh, has could have his own way. Um, you know, through evolution too. There's a theistic evolutionary illuminates that evolution was necessary in order for to create. I'm not saying I believe in that, but like I said, I respect other people's beliefs, and so that's the question. But then the atheist can counter argue that, saying, "There's what about the problem of hell, an eternal hell? Sorry, the problem of an eternal hell for sins committed in finite time." Now, you mentioned finite time earlier, right? And what about animals suffering? Like animals really don't have the free will, right? They don't know the right from wrong, and many animals are carnivorous, so they have to hunt and kill other animals in order to survive. And what about the death of children? Children children are not tested. If children are not really tested, whether are they for their moral characters, because they're still developing. So when a child dies, does the child have a free right to heaven? So the only way that can be the theodicy can defend that is if the afterlife, hell, is not permanent. it's temporary, and uh, heaven applies to not only adult humans but also to children and the lower animals and afterlife. So anyway, that's all. I already said enough. Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. So let me go back to, so you first made a point about how there are so many different belief systems here. That's part of what the FTI is all about. We want to get people with vastly different beliefs together and listening to each other, and with what we call the second intention, where we share our beliefs transparently to other people, and we listen to each other with an open mind. And then the third intention is to hone our critical thinking skills so we can better discern fact from fiction and wisdom from folly. And in doing so, we better understand where we may be off, where we may be making mistakes. And I'm very open to that too. I'm not perfect. Like, I'm presenting an argument here tonight, but I might be wrong. And if someone says, here, Garrett, this is why you're wrong, then I'll just change my opinion. I like to say, if you admit you're wrong with good judgment, you're immediately right again. You're just more right than you were before. The only time anyone's truly wrong is when they insist that they're right, when it's clear that they're wrong. So, I don't think it's good to be attached to our current beliefs. It's much better to seek truth rather than seek to be right. So thank you for observing that, Claudio. That's absolutely part of what FTI is about. As far as evil being necessary because of limited natural resources, if God is omnipotent, why can't he make resources infinite? Why do they have to be finite? We could just keep mining copper and copper will keep coming out of the mine, just like water came from, water got turned into wine in the Bible, right? Like, magic can happen. And I think that miracle very well could have happened. I believe in miracles. I know a lot of people who've experienced miracles, and they're people that I know and trust and I like, and I'm not going to deny their lived experience. I'm going to say, look, if this is what you experienced, okay, that's interesting. It's just not yet explainable by science, but I think that, I'm going to give them the question of the doubt, I'm going to believe them. So I do believe miracles are possible. And I think that if God were omnipotent, he could make resources infinite. So I don't think we necessarily need to experience bad things to appreciate good. And that's where I was saying, if we experience neutral, a little bit of good and a lot of good, then neutral would seem like the bad thing, but really it's neutral. But some of the stuff we see on Earth, babies dying of cancer is like an example where it feels very unjust, right? Is like a baby dying of cancer. Why should a baby die a painful death? I remember first learning about kids with leukemia, and I was like, wow, that I didn't know kids get cancer. I always thought it was people that were much older, but there are lots of children that get cancer, not huge numbers, but a reasonable number. So does that make sense, Claudio?
Yeah, in a way it does make sense, but how would you develop the noble trait of compassion without suffering yourself and seeing other people suffering? How would you cultivate humility
You
unless
would
you
have compassion for
experience?
people who are not experiencing great happiness. The people
Yeah,
experiencing neutrality are the ones that you would feel compassion for. They're still worse off than the people experiencing great good. And you would feel
yeah,
compassion for them. You would still help lift them up. You could still be a hero and help show them how they could be happier and still happier more.
mm,
And so all of the great attributes of heroes and great people can still exist without any harm. It's just
yeah,
we've lived with so much harm for so long, and I think people wanted to believe there was a reason for it. And you know in many respects, it was unavoidable in many perspectives, but huge amounts of human harm were avoidable, and they were just the cause of egotism. And I would argue egotism is the cause of all, and that's actually a good topic for another day. I'm going to add that as a topic. Egotism is the root cause of all harm on earth. I will make that argument another night because I've already made a lot of arguments, enough that I already lost one person because he felt like I was making too many arguments. And another person, I'm normally not able to follow the chat guys, so I did read a little bit, and someone asked for the article about someone who remembered the location of a body, so I'm posting that article. Someone asked for the article about that. But I probably missed a ton of stuff on on the chat, so I apologize for that. There were like 50 comments, and I can't keep track of the talk and the chat at the same time. So I'm a bad multitasker. All human beings are just about. So DLJ, how are you? And thank you, Claudio, for your comments and your contributions. I appreciate it. DLJ, how are you?
I am well. Thank you for asking. How are you?
Good. Ready for your skepticism, my friend. Go ahead.
That wasn't my question because I know everything.
No, that was your question. Sorry, next person. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. So I made 2 pages of indecipherable notes.
I knew you'd have a lot.
So I'll mention a few areas where I think it could be tightened up, and then I'll get to my 2-part question, which is actually quite short because it's just your opinion on top. Yeah, I guess it's an ontological question. So I wasn't happy with the Occam's razor because I think when you say, well, Occam looks for the simplest answer. I think when you go for a creation answer, like what created the spirit? Well, creation, yeah, spirit was created. I don't think that's simplest. I think it's just shortest. So I think I put that in my comment on the paper you wrote a while ago. Also, okay, so areas to tighten up in your you mentioned the word thoughts quite often without having I mean, the model that I'm using, I think that's something I need to define because it's about information flow, and that's between physical, non-physical. So that's where I'm working on. Also on that diagram, of course, you've got conscious and subconscious, which are ill-defined. So that could be tightened up, let alone the use of the word spirit, of course, which is loaded, which leads me back. I'm going backwards in my steps here. It's the evolved versus created part. It kind of rests on this sort of stands or falls, I think, on your interpretation of the mind-body problem, which is your diagram, physical, non-physical. So here's the question. What do you think is the relationship between a self-driving car and the self-driving car's navigation system? With the supplementary part, they're saying, is the self-driving car's navigation system, in your view, non-physical? Or if not, how would you describe it? Because you're a software guy after all, so they must have yeah. So relationship between the hardware and the software effectively, or that's more than that because it's the information flows and everything else. Yep. And therefore, I guess I'm getting to information, is it physical or non-physical? That's the question. Thank you.
I mean, that for me is trivial. Like the self-driving car and the navigation system are all physical. They're not metaphysical. But I'm curious, you said that you think there's a better explanation for the creation event of the metaphysical spirit. So do you believe that the metaphysical spirit would have evolved from a physical world? Well,
I'm okay with the idea of the navigation system having evolved with the car that is navigating, right? So the body being the car in this analogy, right? And the mind being the body's navigation system.
I don't think that's a fair analogy because remember
hang on, just finish it.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I don't see, so if you're, and I'm going with your terminology, if you want that navigation system plus its information to be physical, so I'm using your terminology, then I'm okay with it being physical and non-physical. Although from an ontological point of view, I'm okay with the idea of information being non-physical. I just got I was trying to get to the point where you thought it was downloaded, uploaded. For me, I'm okay with the idea that they both evolve together. Does that make sense?
That what evolved together?
The navigation system, the body and the mind.
But see, I think you're making you're asking a question assuming that they are parallels between body and mind. And I don't think they are parallels between body and mind. Because remember, like if my argument tonight was right, and I would love to go back to where I lost you in the argument and, you know, focus on a question there, maybe when you raise your hand next time, we can go back to like, you know, let me actually paste the slides in the chat, and that way people can, I didn't think to do that. Okay, I just thought to do it. So I'm going to paste the slides in the chat, and if people want to go back to a specific slide and say, hey, look, you lost me on this slide, like help me understand at which slide I lost you in the argument that we have a metaphysical spirit, because it sounds like you don't believe we have a metaphysical spirit. And so there was probably some slide at which you said, hey, Garrett, at this slide, I don't agree with you.
Yeah, so I'm okay with, I mean, I don't, it depends on your, I'm not fixed on whether it's a physical or non-physical. I just think it's an information versus, it's information and physics. Yeah. So it's the car and the car's navigation system. Whether you want to call that physical or non-physical, I'm not hung up on that. But that effectively is the slide, your mind-body slide, same one that Les was questioning, right? And where that consciousness is in terms of microtubules matters less to me, because of the way I see consciousness is it's our real-time audit reporting.
See, consciousness, like consciousness is understood because it's synapses in the brain. The origin of consciousness, like where it begins, is what's not understood.
Sure.
So when I was describing that diagram, what I was showing is the origin of consciousness, which is the part that's not understood, which is the metaphysical spirit, and how it impacts the physical brain, which is the part of consciousness that is understood. Okay.
Yeah.
So
all right. Other than that, it's jumping between your system view versus the biological, I mean, the biochemical view. I mean, you could sort of have those on separate diagrams if you wanted to. I think.
Yeah, I mean,
system,
like everything physical is pretty well understood after the quantum level. So I don't bother explaining that stuff in detail because I don't know it as well as a doctor would explain it, and a doctor could write a diagram of the brain, and neuroscientists know the physical parts of the brain very well, and cool, great. I'm not going to add any value there. It's not a mystery. So the part that interests me is the part that's today a mystery, which is what's the origin of consciousness, and that's what I'm trying to explain.
Right. Okay. So that's the bit we disagree, because you've got that line between the non-physical and the physical, and yet you said the navigation system is physical. So therefore, for me, there's no line. If you want to call that physical, you take the line away.
The navigation system of a car is different than the navigation system of the consciousness. That's what I'm saying. Is you're making a false analogy. You're saying that the navigation system of the car is the same, and software of a car is the same as the metaphysical spirit, and they're different. The metaphysical spirit doesn't physically exist. It's not a physical thing. It's not made out of mass energy. Whereas the software is all bits and bytes. It's gates. I built microprocessors out of gates. Like, I know how gates work. They're understandable. They're physical. They're all very easily explainable with science. The origins of consciousness are not explainable by science. So it's a very different entity than than a piece of software.
The holistic thing of 2 + 2 was 5. And I'm saying that number 5 is just
dog.
What's that, Mike? I don't know if you knew that he was off mute.
He was on mute.
So if it's okay, DLG, let's go to the next person. And if you don't mind, go to the slide where I lost you. It might have been on the first one on free will, because I don't think you agree with my argument on free will. So
I don't, but no, it was that physical, non-physical side. That's where we disagree.
Got it. Krish, how are you?
Yes, I'm sorry, I couldn't. I was not ready. Okay, so my question is very simple. I'm going to argue that there is only one higher power. There cannot be more than one. There has to be only one, because if they two have, God forbid, difference of opinion, the person who is following them will be totally lost about who to follow. So there cannot be two higher powers. There has to be only one higher power, and this higher power should do everything in his power to keep communicating with the lower powers about his existence, his or her existence, whatever it is, his or her, that object's existence, and there should has to be some sort of a connection between the higher power and the lower power. Otherwise, it's not benevolent. Correct? The higher power has to periodically keep sending prophets to the lower power, which is the humans, to explain them how to live on this planet. And people have the responsibility of interpreting these words of the prophets the right way and finding the right path to proper existence. That has happened through debates. So in today's world, it happens through physical power and military power. When that moves up to debates as the single way to which we solve our differences, never resorting to violence, only debates, logical debates in a group of people with moderators, judges, total transparency, capacity to bring about any kind of evidence, whatever evidence they want, they should be able to submit it. There should be no bias. And no evidence can be simply rejected simply because it was rejected once before. So many pieces of time, right? This has already been diluted. This theory is wrong. We can't apply it. No, the theory was wrong probably in the past. Today I have new evidence. I can prove it again and I'll use the same theory. So that's a kind of openness we need to have. So if you do that, you can find it. But my point is there's only one God and one God is sufficient. And good and evil are equally important and equally necessary for the existence of this planet. Light is the absence of dark. Light and darkness have a relationship. Darkness is the absence of light. Darkness means nothing exists there. Light means something exists there. If darkness wants to prevail over light, it will cease to exist along with light. If light wants to prevail, it needs to have some darkness to expand. If light wants to expand, it has to find darkness. That's where it will expand. If darkness wants to expand fully, it will cease to exist. So they know the yin and yang principle. They both are necessary for each other's existence. They're both necessary for each other's existence.
So Krish, I didn't understand, you said if there's only one higher power, because if there are two and they disagree, and then I lost your argument at that point. Can you explain that better?
When there are two higher powers and there is a disagreement between them, then how would you know as a follower which of them is correct?
Well, I mean, that's like saying if you have, dual reporting lines in your company and you have two people that you report to, and they both tell you to do different things. One tells you to help his division and the other tells you to help his division. How do you decide which one to follow?
Yes, you have a problem. So that's the reason why that's the reason why it has to be single. That is my whole logic.
It could be three, and then you go with the majority.
What's that?
Well,
David?
if you go with, majority again means that a majority view can be taken in an objective manner. How do you know the majority view can be even from today? We have all democracy and all these things. Nothing works. All majority, nothing works. Even, I mean, this majority concept doesn't work in today's world. Well, how do you think it'll work in a place like heaven?
Well, do you think that feudalism works better than democracy, Krish?
Feudalism also does not work. We cannot have an hierarchical system. We used to have a system in the past, which is called.
Krish,
Yes.
if you look at the quality of life under democracies and you look at the quality of life under autocracies, there's a drastic difference, and the quality of life for the human beings living in democracy is much, much higher.
There used to be a system before the democracies came into existence where human beings lived even better than any of the current democracies. They were people living in indigenous people living in this country, Africa, and all around the world. People have existed for 40,000 years. Democracy came to exist only 200 years back. Before that, for the last 2000 period, 2000, 3000, 4000, last few thousand of known history is when we had an area of conflict. Before that, people lived peacefully. There were one civilization living peacefully, another civilization comes into the mix. There was black people living peacefully all over the world. White people came into the picture, and then there started conflicts. And now we are trying to find a way to live peacefully between various cultures. And that is what we have to worry right now. We have to worry, okay, fine, it's all happened. Let's see
Krish,
what we can do to fix the problem.
I would encourage you to read Steven Pinker's book on enlightenment now, because I think you may not have a clear, and if you do have a clear picture of history, share links on the sources that say white people are the cause of all conflict, because all of the
No, I never said white people are not the cause. Oh no, white people are not the cause of all. Please. It's a misunderstanding. White people are not the cause of all conflict.
Right.
Black people and white people have differences. That differences is the cause of all conflicts. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, all I would say though is that the amount
I'm
of
not putting a
conflict-
blame on either side. No side is singly responsible. Each
Right.
side has to share 50% of the blame.
Well, all I'm saying is that modern democracies have the healthiest, wealthiest societies that humanity has ever known.
Could that
And
be
democracy has
indoctrination?
existed, by the way, for 2 millennia,
Yeah.
roughly a
Could
little
that
over
be
2
an
millennia.
indoctrination in your mind that democracies work? Because if you go to China and ask the people in China, they will say, democracy, what is that? We have whatever we have is working great for us. You can
Let's
ask the
stay
people
on
in Russia,
let's stay
they
on topic
say the
because
same thing.
Chris, we're getting off onto
All
democracy.
right, now mind. Now mind. We'll
Which
talk
I'm
tomorrow.
happy to have a conversation on another day, but that's not tonight's topic.
Yeah,
push-
sure, no problem.
So as far as like higher powers needing to communicate to lower powers and good and evil both being necessary, I tried to make an argument that we could, a higher power could create neutral, a little bit good and a lot good. So what part of that did you not agree with? Like
I agree with that totally. I think higher power is working towards that. It is going to happen, but even higher power, like you said, it's not omnipotent, it's not omniscient, it is not. Higher power is also learning. Higher
Right.
power is learning just along with us how to help us. It has to experiment, trying to help us in different ways and failing and finally finding the right way to help us.
Mhm.
That's what I'm saying. I'm
Yeah.
saying higher power is trying equally hard to help us right now. If we are patient, we cooperate with the higher power, then we can become infinitesimally benefited and the whole world will change. Ubuntu, that used to be the principle, right? Give, live and let live. Share freely. The Indian, when Christopher Columbus came to the American continents, he has written in his diaries, these people gave everything for free. We went and asked them, they just gave it. What kind of idiots are these? Only small army is enough. We can take everything from these people. That was Christopher Columbus' point of view. One small army, we can take everything from these people. These people like, why do you need an army to come and take everything from us? You ask, we will give. See, that used to be the life of the people here. We can go there again. We will go there again. That is my belief.
Thank you for sharing, Krish. I want to keep going through questions. Akshat.
Yeah, I just was curious to know or make an observation. I think spirit comes from the unity field. It doesn't see in duality. So for
Sorry, from where? Say that again.
unity. So it doesn't have polarity, for example. So good and bad, light and darkness, it's technically the same thing. It's just a different scale, as you're mentioning. So for it to go through the process of quantum mechanics or quantum field to basically make a decision and decide between what it needs to decide in terms of free will, then the free will bias also doesn't exist, because if people have free will, then they're always going to be for something to make themselves either better or see more profit or seek the betterment of themselves. And for example, if you have a goal of happiness, for example, then every means or to the ends is to that goal. And I think that when you have a particular goal, then there is no choice per se, and then your free will basically becomes a means thing and becomes a cycle where you're trying to pursue that goal. And I think that because of that, free will itself doesn't exist in that particular system. That's my take on it.
Free will what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
Yeah. So if you have free will, and you are trying to find, for example, have a goal, for example, in this case, it's happiness, or self-improvement, then all your resources and all your thinking or all your thoughts or all your actions will be towards that goal. And in the pursuit of that goal, you are not going to take an opposite direction or the direction that will take you away from that goal. So free will itself is an illusion based on the concept of having a goal. It's the same thing as they talk about cause and effect, right? In the Hermetic principles, where you really do not know what the actual cause is for the primary cause of what it is to the effects. And sometimes you, as human, for example, do not have the time or privilege to see all effects in the end.
So
So
you're bringing
basically,
up multiple subjects here. Let me try to address the first one you said, is that you said spirit comes from unity. Does that
Yeah.
mean that you believe the spirit is physical?
no, spirit is something that's non-tangible. It doesn't exist in the physical plane because the physical plane, from my understanding, is 1% of the 99%, which is the rest. So our physical existence or physical plane is very minimal compared to the spirit plane, for example, or energy plane. And in the energy plane, you do not have polarity because polarity is something that happens in the physical plane. For things to exist in the physical plane, you need to have something to judge against or compare it against something, right? Energy, for example.
When you say energy, do you mean like a photon is energy? Is that the kind of energy you mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. So energy basically going away from particle, right?
Going away
Uh,
from what?
Energy would be a waveform, right? Energy is observed in waveforms. When you go from waveform into more, for example, higher density objects or
Right.
particles, then that's when you get into the physical plane. And there's that concept as well as, I believe, as above, so below. And that's also one of the Hermetic principles. And that actually talks about the physical plane having correspondences in the energy plane. So theoretically speaking, spirit, whatever happens in the spirit plane also happens in the conscious, subconscious, and the physical plane. That's how I view it.
Okay, I think I would love to continue this conversation with you in
No
the
worries.
community. I don't think I can fully
Thanks
understand
for
your
the
perspective in the time that we have with all the hands up. So, because we only have 15 minutes left, but I'm not quite following. Like for me, like things are either physical or not physical, and mass energy is the term used for both mass and energy. Photons are energy, and physical things are a combination of mass and energy. But those are all physical things, whereas the spirit, if my argument is right, is metaphysical, meaning it's not made out of mass energy. And if monism is right, there's only one substance that creates everything. And so I realize you probably come from a background where monism is just kind of assumed to be correct, but I would love to hear a defense that monism is correct after understanding the argument I gave tonight. I didn't hear it in your question, so I can't really address it, but I would love to understand it better if you want to join the Discord community and we could talk about it there. Would that be okay, Akshat?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Carrie. Go ahead.
Okay, so just for the record, I'm not necessarily criticizing your presentation at all. At this point, I think I'm an evolving dualist because that's the only thing I can see that gets us past the consciousness problem. Now, how
Right.
that relates to free will is a completely different, subset of the discussion. And I wonder if it's even a meaningful concept, but we can discuss that at a later date. My concern though is our defining God on the basis of our evaluation of justice. Right? So I've got a quote here. If horses or oxen or lions had hands and could draw and could sculpt like men, then the horses would draw their gods like horses and oxen like oxen, and each would shape bodies of gods in their likeness, each kind of their own. And that's Xenophanes from a long time ago. And I guess, there was a super influential book, at least for me, I read years and years ago called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, where a bunch of philosophers and scientists tried to take kind of a reverse approach to defining God. And rather than trying to define God and then look for evidence, what they did is let's look at what evidence there is and see how we should or could define a God that's consistent with the world that we see. Right. So it throws the morals and the ethics out the window, right, in terms of what we want, because I don't know, I think it's pretty self-evident that nature doesn't really care what we think. Right. Our job is to try to figure out what is and come up with a description that makes sense and yields predictive results. So, you know, being that we are mammals and we have certain values embedded us, I mean, the ethics and morals of spiders are completely different. You know, if we were, you know, evolved from that lineage and were super, you know, intelligent, conscious spider beings, you know, our God might be an incredibly alien conception compared to what a mammalian God would be. So it's just something I kind of want to throw out there and just say, hey, you know, why are we fixating on these particular aspects of things like benevolence when, I mean, what we see in the world is what we see in the world, right? The purpose of it, that's a tough question to answer. It's more like, what would the nature be? So anyway, I'll leave it there, but thank you very, very much.
So are you basically saying that by me saying we should help people achieve their goals and try to prevent the amount of harm that people suffer, that I'm defining God in man's image instead of, you know, vice versa per se?
No, I don't think there's anything wrong with humanism. I think it's absolutely wonderful. I just think to ascribe God to be a humanist is a step that's not necessarily justified. There can still be something we could call God that doesn't embody humanist ideals.
So what would you say is a more likely sense? So I guess what would you say is a more likely set of goals that God would have for us other than the one that feels fair for us?
Well, I mean, the first thing I notice is there seems to be an absolute priority on what we call reality. So you presented some ideas of how the world could be, and it involved magic or miracles or, you know, things that were not causally determined. And that seems to be a principle that the let's say creative backbone of the universe doesn't support, at least very obviously.
What do you
Right?
think I said that was not causally determined?
Well, when you said that there could be a world where there's free will, where our choices, we had choices, but they were limited, and the harm that we would and suffering we would have to endure could be eliminated. We don't see that world.
Right.
So I would say that the values of God don't include that kind of universe, because I mean, it's certainly conceivable, sure, and that's not what we see, and that's for sure. So I would say that that's not necessarily one of God's values.
Well, I mean, if God was omnipotent, then you could say that's not one of his values. But if God was not omnipotent, that very well could be one of his values, because we are actually getting closer to that world every year, like, and every decade and every 100 years, we're getting closer and closer to that world. So that's why I made the argument that I think God is powerful and benevolent and does want these things to happen, and they are happening. They're just happening over the long arc of time. And if you watch the news, you'll think they're not happening, but they are. And this is the direction we're moving in.
Okay. I mean, the idea of an evolving universe is, I mean, that was actually the ones that I think it was it Tipler and somebody else wrote the anthropic cosmological principle, and that was their
No,
view.
that's not what I'm trying to get at with that.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that the free will that God has and that higher powers have and that humans have are all combining to make the world a better place where people, please stop, where people do achieve, sorry, my 7-year-old daughter covering my mouth. No, que no hagas eso. Por favor, no. Where people are achieving more human goals on a regular basis, and the amount of harm being caused on Earth is decreasing. Does that make sense? And so I think we're moving in the direction of what I'm saying is a desirable goal. And I think humans that I've spoken with, like, would agree that that's a desirable goal. I haven't heard someone come up with a logical reason that increasing happiness and decreasing harm, and I'm summarizing like a more complicated argument, which I gave another day, que no puedo ahora, 10 minutos. I think, I haven't heard a good reason that that's not a good goal to go after. And if we can't think of a good reason that it's not a good goal to go after, then I would argue a higher power would probably support such a goal. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe someone will come up with a better goal, and cool, I'm open to that, and I would love to hear it. But until someone comes up with a better argument, I'm going to believe the argument that sounds pretty convincing to me.
Sure.
Because I think God gave us the reason to use our own judgment, and we should. So I'm going to.
I am absolutely not saying that when we look at the world and say that I see potentially an amoral existence, therefore we should be amoral. I'm not saying that at all.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just because someone does something bad doesn't mean we should all do something bad. Like, I don't think that's not a sound argument, just because someone.
Yeah, the stage that has been set for us certainly allows us to make the world as good a place as can possibly be constructed. And I think that's the best option that we have going forward. So we're in 100% agreement there.
Okay. Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kerry. Benjamin, go ahead.
Hello. Hi. So first of all, I think helping people is great. You said that you're part of a system where you help people like do terrible things less or learn to value their lives or however it is. That's a great thing. So I think what you're doing is great. I have a hard time in arguing anything past the free will aspect because I feel like I disagree with the premise that gets you to spirit, that then gets you to have arguments in this realm of non-physical. I do understand what you say when you say that scientists have proven that decisions are made before we are aware. I agree, and this is valid. I do feel that the step that you took from there with that PowerPoint and how you described was a means to place free will into this space to say that even though the decisions are made before we are aware, this is how we can still say that we had free will. And what I disagree with some of, it's more of like the method by which you use your arguments. I'm not saying that you're incorrect on any of your stuff. I do believe in value. I value people's lives. I'm a paramedic, so I don't watch the news. I understand what you're saying. But when you say something like, scientists have yet to discover what happened before the Big Bang and therefore blank, that is what I understand to be a misunderstanding of how science works. That is just not how science functions as
that's not what I said. That's not what I said, by the way. I said scientists don't have a good explanation, not that they have not discovered. There's a difference. There's no evidence. All evidence of what happened before the Big Bang was wiped out in what they call the singularity. So even if something existed before, all of the data from that, existence is completely wiped out. So I get that. The question is, how did the singularity even come about in the first place?
So I'm not
an explanation for that.
I'm not arguing for or against that. What I'm saying is, if you're saying that science hasn't brought us here yet, and therefore I'm inputting my own explanation.
No,
hold on. This is how the argument of God of the gaps is formed. It's like, well, science hasn't brought us here yet, so I have a better reason that is brought about logically, including evidence and logical reasoning involving a realm not in the physical world, meaning something that is not testable, reproducible, and retestable by somebody else in a matter of as science. So this is at its core a God of the gaps argument. And again, I'm not denying everything that you're saying. I'm just saying as far as like this concept of saying this, therefore, this is what makes more sense to me. This is not how logical reasoning works in that sense. It's not because this feels good that this is more likely to be true. That the better question is we don't know what happened there yet. Period. We don't. So like inputting something that you did know and that you believe it makes sense to have known, and then you create more arguments off of that, is what I feel to be a God of the gaps argument. But again, on my original premise, I disagree in that what you call the spirit is what you say it is. I do feel like you're talking about something that is real, and actually I agree with you. I just don't think it's called spirit. I think you're talking about everything that the body is, that we receive in stimulus and influence, and thus make a decision. But to relabel that as a metaphysical thing that is not part of physical space, I feel is a leap in from logical reasoning into like more, I want it to be this way, rather than something that is more logically sound in an argument.
Yeah, I hear you, but I actually want it to be the other way. So you have a misunderstanding about what I want. I would much rather the world be deterministic and I'm not responsible for any of the stupid shit that I've done in my life. That would feel much better for me. So, you know, I don't necessarily want to believe that there's libertarian free will. And in fact, like I said, I was so strong of a determinist atheist that I went about trying to prove Godel wrong. And he was like a very famous computer scientist.
Right. I understand what you say. Yeah, and that's valid.
I didn't want to believe this. I came to this belief because it was the most logical thing that I could explain. And when you say that, you said that just because something makes more sense to someone that you shouldn't believe it, that's like saying, well,
not at all. That's not what I'm saying.
I mean, that was what you said. You said this makes
in
more
the context
sense to me, and therefore I believe
in the context of science hasn't brought us here, and therefore it feels good to me to input my idea here.
That's not my argument. My argument is science doesn't have a good explanation for this. I have what I think is a good explanation for it, and that's how science has progressed for thousands of years.
No, that's not how science works.
People came up with better explanations for things.
Science
and just hang on. I let you speak. Let me speak too. So when Galileo came around, he said, "Look, I have a better explanation for what's going on. You know, it's not that the sun revolves around the earth, it's that the earth revolves around the sun." And he got threatened to be put at the stake for saying that. So he had a better logical explanation. He believed it was true, and he had the evidence to back it up. And I think I have the evidence to back this up too. Now, I may be wrong. And if you can logically prove some part of my argument wrong after watching my presentation on free will and the other presentations, go ahead and point it out, and I'll accept I'm wrong if I'm wrong. I have no problem with that. And I don't have a stake in anything being like I don't care if I'm right about what I believe now. That doesn't matter to me at all. And I'm probably one of the rare people that doesn't care about whether or not I'm right now, because I know that if I'm not right now, if I'm jumping to a new idea, it's because it's a better idea, and I'm just going to be more right agreeing with that. So I have no ego in like being right about what I believe now. I don't care if I'm right. All I care about is that I'm seeking truth. And I would ask you if in your heart, you're doing the same.
Yeah. So, I absolutely love conversations like this because it brings open new realms of thought and idea. And I understand, I heard your presentation. It was a lot of very good, passionate information. I can see, I don't know if I really fully believe you say you don't care. You do seem very passionate about what you have brought to the table, and I thought it was wonderful. But in any case, what I'm trying to say is that it is even if I don't have a logical argument in that realm outside of the physical world to argue with you, because it's not possible for me to do that. I'm saying I can still argue the method by which you got there and the information that I received.
Yeah, I want you to. And let's continue in the online community. I want to let Christina and Jenny go. And then I got to put these young ladies to sleep. So thank you, Benjamin, for your comments.
Of course.
Please come to the online community. Go to freethinkerinstitute.org. You'll get a link to our Discord community. I'd love to continue to chat with you about this. I feel like we have a lot more to talk about, Benjamin. I think we didn't sync up yet. Like we are not on the same plane in terms of the conversation, and I really value what you're saying, but we don't have enough time because it's already after 9, and 9 is usually when we shut down, mostly because I have to put them to sleep, and I also have to go to sleep because they wake me up early. So apologies for the not being able to stay late, but that's kind of where I am right now in life.
No problem. Yeah.
But thanks so much for your comments, Benjamin, and I
Thank
welcome
you.
your questioning. That's what the free thinking is all about. So thank you for that. And Christina, how are you? Good to see you.
I am good, thank you. Good to see you too, but I won't share my camera because I lose
okay.
some energy.
It's
some,
okay. Cameras are optional,
anyway,
Christina. We always
some
love to
band.
see people, and I appreciate everyone that's on camera, but you know, we record these. Not everyone wants to be recorded, and I get it. So cameras are optional.
It's not that I'm losing band when I put
Oh yeah, it sounds like you have
my
bandwidth
camera.
issues. So
Anyway,
that's
I have
even
some
better
rhetorical
reason,
questions.
Christina. Go ahead.
Yeah, so some rhetorical questions. Why do you need an afterlife? Why do you need a God? Are you that attached to life? And did you stop to look at what exactly you want? How does really God help you more than a therapist or a friend or a parent? Because all the other technical things we can learn by ourselves, or we can go to classes. So in my mind, God doesn't help the world, the physical world in which we live. And also there might be a theory that God is actually a need for a parent that failed you because he couldn't help you all your life. He cannot replicate the heaven you had as a baby when you received everything. For those lucky, because there are people who didn't have a good
I'm up
childhood.
to 4 questions now, Christina. Let me try to answer the ones you've given so far, and we can go through more in the online community. So, did you stop to look? So, why do we need an afterlife? I don't think we need an afterlife. I just don't think that the scientific experiments showing that children remember things from a past life. If you read the article I sent about a 3-year-old child uncovering where its past life body was buried, I don't think you can explain that. Like, how do you explain that without past lives? How do you explain not just one experimenter that is kind of like out there, like who has soul experiments that are not reproducible, but you know, dozens, if not more than that, of experimenters that come to the same conclusion, probably including skeptics, although I haven't fully validated that. But if one of you is skeptical enough, run your own study. I really encourage it. Run your own study and try to study the supposed memories of children and try to explain those memories without a past life. The ones that I've read about, there's no other explanation, you know, other than potentially that the researcher was totally biased and just made shit up, which I will be honest, some researchers do make shit up. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, but to think that every single one of the past life experimenters were doing that, little hard to fathom. So I don't think we need an afterlife. I just think that it's more defensible than that we don't have one. You know, to think that a metaphysical spirit would be one-time use, like one and done, that didn't make sense to me. And it also doesn't explain why these children have, you know, memories of what they believe is a past life, where I don't know that they even think about it that way. They just say, I was killed here, and they point the parents to where the body was buried. So
maybe they listen to too many stories. I don't know. I don't
but
know.
Christina, if they listen to too many stories, how would they know where there was an actual body buried? Like, what story would tell them that there were, like, how many places can you dig up ground and find a dead human being that no one knew was buried there?
Even that story
3-year-old
could
child
be
come up with that?
constructed. Even that story could be constructed, you know?
Yeah, but Christina, read the studies, read the research. There are so many studies that there's a meta study about this.
Yeah, but the thing is, I don't need a God, you see? I don't need.
I don't care if you need a God or not, Christina. The question is whether or not you're seeking truth. Do you want to know whether or not there is one? And if you don't, it's okay. I don't think you need to believe in God to be a good person. I know a lot of atheists that are really better people than a lot of people that I know that believe in God. So I don't think believing in God is important. I don't think
And I
God
think
cares.
I think there
Just
are more
let me finish,
interesting.
Christina.
Sorry.
I don't think God cares whether we believe in him or not, quite frankly.
Of
All I
course,
think
but
that
I think,
matters is that we do good in this world. That's all that I think God cares about, is whether we do good in this world.
well, that also is disputable, but there are more interesting things to read about whatever a 3 years old child dreamed about and where those bodies are. Yeah, you could study physics, mathematics, or history, or whatever. Anyway, yeah.
Well, Christina, if you don't think doing good in the world is important, I think you may be surprised after you pass away. So I
Well,
will just tell you
I
that.
don't know what that good is, because you can think you do good, but
increasing happiness and decreasing harm after seeing the truth clearly is doing good.
I'm not sure you can help all those homeless people, or even the elections.
That's like saying you can't fly and therefore you can't do any good.
I don't say I'm looking for good, but I don't need a God for that.
I didn't say you need a God, Christina. I told you that I don't think God even cares whether or not you believe he exists. He just wants you to be a good person. And I think he wants all of us to be good people. And I think in your heart of hearts, Christina, when you do bad things, that you know it, if you're listening to your heart.
Yeah, but why should I put an equality between good and God?
I don't think it
Why?
matters if you do.
Yeah, to me it doesn't matter.
Then that's fine. Don't let it matter to you. I don't think it matters. All that matters, Christina, is that you do good in this world. That's all that matters. And what that means is helping people achieve their goals, as long as those goals don't cause significant unnecessary harm, and preventing the
Yeah,
amount of harm that
because
happens
this
to
is
everybody.
not just nice talking, Not, we are just nice talking.
I have to go, Christina. It's 10
Yeah.
minutes past and my daughters are begging me
I,
to put them
I
to
just,
sleep. So
yeah,
Jenny, go ahead.
Yeah, very, very quickly. Okay. All I wanted to say is this. I agree with you that root of most evil and problems that human race experiences because of ego. And I absolutely look forward to that topic when it comes about. And two, I just want to tell you, it's such a treat to see your sleepy, tired daughters
They want to
hanging
go to
about
sleep
you
badly.
last 15, 20 minutes. It's been a treat. And oh, it's time for their bedtime. It's time
It
to
is.
go to
It's
bed. Good
past
night,
their
girls.
bedtime.
You're
They should have
absolutely
gone to sleep
beautiful.
over an hour ago. So
Yeah, yeah. Good night. Thank you so much, Garrett.
thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Thanks, everyone, for your comments, questions. Really good discussion. Appreciate everybody's time and hope to see you guys in the online community. And next week, I forgot, I usually try to put the meeting for next week. I forget what's next week. But it actually may be the wrong thing posted, so we may be changing it. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, we'll have another event next week. We do this almost every Tuesday. And so thanks again, everyone, for coming and for the great questions and comments. Have a good night.